Hey everybody, and welcome back to another Max Velocity weather forecast. And in today's forecast, we'll be breaking down a new storm that we have to watch for very closely as we get closer to the weekend, because it could bring a significant severe weather event to parts of the United States, including the risk for significant damaging winds, large hail, and even maybe a few tornadoes. I'll give you the latest breakdown on everything that you need to know in this forecast, but let's first begin with what's happening across the United States today. And we'll first begin with the Central Plains and as well as the Midwest. And this is an area that we've been watching a ton of rainfall over the past 12 to 24 hours. There's been some flooding that has begun to ramp up near St. Louis and as well as a large chunk of Missouri. And more of that is expected throughout the day today, mainly because of the fact we have a stationary frontal boundary that's going to be allowing for more showers and storms across a very large area. But as of right now, the convection has become a bit weaker. The rainfall overall is a little bit less than what we saw earlier. You can notice earlier today there's a lot more red, which indicates higher cloud tops, which also usually indicates heavier rainfall. We're not seeing nearly as much of that anymore. It's more of that green shade, which is going to be lower cloud tops and light to moderate rain for the most part. But we're going to see that ramp up more later today, and again we'll talk about more on that later in this forecast. Back over to the south, we have our heat dome that's sitting over in the southern plains, and this is bringing that relentless heat to parts of Texas, Oklahoma, and a large chunk of the Great Plains back through the southeast. Temperatures have been as high as 110 degrees in parts of Texas. So again, very hot weather continues. And then back in the southwest United States, parts of like areas like the Four Corner states have actually been getting a very small break from the massive heat that we've been seeing, like Phoenix, Arizona, for example. Phoenix, Arizona, nearly every day last month was above 110 degrees at some point during the day. The last day of the month was only 108 degrees, so it was actually below it for the first time. But overall, it's been really hot over there. We are seeing a small break from that, but it's going to start to ramp up again as we get closer to the weekend. And that'll allow again for that severe weather threat. We're going to talk about more on that here in a second. But before then, we have a lot of watches and warnings across the United States as of right now. Flood watches in effect for parts of Missouri, Illinois, and Kentucky. Heat advisories in effect in those orange boxes that goes all the way up through Kansas and as well as Missouri. And then excessive heat warnings in the purple boxes. That includes a large chunk of Texas, Oklahoma, Louisiana, Mississippi, and Arkansas. And then you have red flag warnings, and that is because it's so dry, so hot, and as well as very windy across parts of central Texas. So there's going to be that threat as well for some wildfires later today. That threat was yesterday, and we're going to see that happen again today just because of the conditions that are currently ongoing in those areas. And that's where the heat dome is currently sitting, which makes things just so much worse there. Now let's talk more about the weather pattern over the next several days. There's a lot to talk about in terms of the weather pattern, because this will all lead into that threat for a severe weather event as we go into Friday, Saturday, and perhaps even into Sunday of this week. It's going to get very active very quickly here in the United States. So as of right now, the heat dome is sitting in the southern plains, very defined right now. That's where we have that heat dome that's bringing excessive heat to many areas. Jet streams lifted back up here to the north. We have that cool down that's impacting parts of the northeast. By the way, upstate New York was as low as the mid 30s this morning. Not even kidding. It was very cold up there, and it's because of this cold blast that those areas are seeing. And by the way, we're in August. I don't use the word cold blast very often, but that's pretty chilly, especially for this time of the year. Once we get closer to Thursday and to Friday, that heat dome doesn't move a whole lot, but it becomes a little bit weaker, and it moves actually slightly to the west, and that's going to start to allow for this jet stream to not just weaken out, but we'll eventually see a jet stream kind of tail further to the south, and this could allow for a cool down in parts of the central and southern plains as we get closer to the weekend and into early next week. Then once we go into the weekend, that is when that trough will start to develop. But you'll notice this is where the low pressure system will be going into Saturday night into Sunday morning. It is nowhere really near strong upper level winds, because this trough that we're going to see develop is going to be based at the lower levels, which will increase the damaging wind threat with any severe weather. In addition to that, it's going to really have a better chance of producing maybe a few tornadoes with weaker upper level winds. This could create more of an MCS situation. We could very well see a very severe mesoscale convective system, which is essentially a line of storms that will be moving west to east across this area. So let's talk more about what this looks like. As of right now, going into Saturday, there is a slight risk for severe weather, and this includes parts of the Central Plains, primarily Kansas, Missouri, Nebraska, and as well as Colorado. Now, I do want to point out this is on Saturday, and this is subject to change, and it will probably get a little bit larger, and I would not rule out at least an enhanced risk of severe weather with this particular event, mainly for the damaging wind threat. But once we go into Sunday, we'll likely see this area expand into the Midwest and as well as into the Ohio Valley, and this is where we could be watching again for a pretty significant severe weather event, with all modes of severe weather being possible, but the main concerns would be damaging winds and also maybe a few tornadoes. But this is something we have to watch really closely over the next several days, because again, things will change as we get closer. Now, in terms of the low-level jet, I mentioned I was going to show you what this looks like at the lower levels. This thing is pretty intense, at least on the future radar from the European model. This is going into Saturday night. This is your low pressure system in the lower levels. It has a pretty intense area of low-level winds across areas like Nebraska, and this could increase the threat for damaging winds primarily across those areas. Once we go into Sunday, look how intense this thing gets going towards the Midwest. We're going to see some very strong low-level winds across parts of Missouri and Illinois. This is basically the Midwest, and this is where we have to watch for that ever-growing potential for damaging winds as the system moves further to the east. And going into Monday, it continues to track that direction with very intense winds in the lower levels, which with the low-level jet, that's what we're looking at here, that can help rotate supercells at the lower levels. Now, the winds right now are being forecasted more west to east. If they're more southwest to northeast, that would definitely be a bit more concerning for that tornado risk. So we have to watch this again very closely over the next several days. This is what it looks like on the future radar. Again, notice in the central plains where that low pressure system forms once we go into late Saturday, and this is where we'll be watching again for that potential for an MCS, and that is a mesoscale convective system that would increase the risk again for damaging winds, perhaps a few tornadoes. Going into late Sunday, those storms move toward the Midwest, towards areas as well in the Ohio Valley, and eventually going into the overnight hours Sunday into Monday, that would move further to the east. But again, we are several days out, so timing and locations are with 100% subject to change. So definitely make sure again that you're staying tuned with Max Velocity. Make sure you subscribe down below. We'll keep you posted with the latest details there. Now, in terms of the flooding threat over the next few days, we have one today, and it's really concerning across parts of the lower Midwest and as well as back in areas like Missouri and Illinois. That's the main concern for today in terms of extreme flash flooding with the threat of excessive rainfall. Right now, the Weather Prediction Center has that moderate risk for excessive rainfall across parts of areas like St. Louis, basically eastern Missouri and southwest Illinois. This is where very heavy rain is likely today. In addition to this, there's also a threat for severe weather with isolated damaging winds, maybe a little bit of isolated large hail, and perhaps a brief tornado being possible. This is the timing though for right now. Storms will fire up throughout the late afternoon and evening hours. They'll push down to the south and southeast, going toward areas like St. Louis, but this will continue to develop overnight tonight as well, with additional rainfall being possible. This will increase the amount of rain that's already on the ground there, and this could equivalent to a little bit more flash flooding overnight, and eventually going into Thursday, things should start to dry up a bit more. In terms of what we've seen in rainfall over the past about 12 hours and what we're going to see throughout the rest of tonight, it's pretty concerning. We're looking at a pretty widespread 2 to 4 inches across this region from southwest parts of Illinois into eastern Missouri and as well as into western Kentucky. Some isolated locations could get as high as 6 to 8 inches of rainfall. So definitely make sure that you're monitoring your weather very closely, and especially if you're out on the roadways, it's going to be very dangerous traveling for sure tonight. And by the way, this is the risk of severe weather for today. Again, we have that slight risk of severe weather primarily for Missouri for isolated damaging winds, perhaps a little bit of an isolated large hailstone, and also again maybe a brief tornado. Going into tomorrow, things get much more interesting. We do have an enhanced risk of severe weather for parts of northwest Kansas, southwest Nebraska, and northeast Colorado, and I might go live for this tomorrow, so make sure you click the bell icon down below so you're notified if and when I go live, and make sure you subscribe to the channel. Slight risk surrounding that as well. The main concerns right now are damaging winds and some significant hail. Timing for tomorrow, storms will fire up during the mid to late afternoon hours, moving to the east. We'll see a cluster or if not a line of storms develop going into the mid-evening or so sometime around 6, 7, 8 o'clock. This will move to the east, and eventually by 9 to 10 o'clock, these storms are going through parts of central Kansas and Nebraska. This will weaken out before it really gets to Kansas City, but it might still produce at least some gusty winds by the morning hours, around 5 in the morning or so. So definitely make sure you're protecting your plants and anything else that might be outdoors that could end up blowing away, including your flying trampolines. Thanks so much for watching. Make sure to like button down below and subscribe if you've not already.